explicitly to call for 100% coal phase out in Ontario. And we were small, strategic, we built a coalition, and we won. It took 17 years, but by 2014, March of 2014, Ontario burned its last lump of coal. So we went from 25% of our electricity grid in the late 90s that we received from burning coal to zero. It did improve air quality substantially, we think, though it's hard to know exactly. But it was a very successful campaign. It is hailed by all of Canada as the largest greenhouse gas reduction initiative in Canada and, in fact, in North America, equivalent to taking 7 million cars off the road. So I use that as an example of what a small, mighty group of activists can achieve with super strategic political activism. Thank you. So this is where we get our electricity today in Ontario. Like I mentioned in the plenary, we are the second largest or most nuclearized jurisdiction in the world. We have 20 reactors, of which 18 are working. And we get around 60% of our electricity from nuclear power, a quarter from hydropower, but we've essentially maxed out our cost-effective hydro resources, some natural gas and some wind. We implemented a Green Energy Act at the same time that we began to phase out coal power. And we brought in wind and solar, a feed-in tariff program, but there has been massive opposition, so the government has slowed down on that. Thank you. So this is just a comparison of Ontario with Manitoba and Quebec, how they get their electricity versus how Ontario gets its electricity. So we're surrounded. Manitoba, the province of Manitoba west of us, if you're not all from Canada, and Quebec to the east. Quebec gets 98% of its electricity from renewable water power, and Manitoba gets 96%, and Ontario gets about 25%. Thank you. Malfunction. Yes. Now, comparing those three provinces, our electricity rates, Ontario, we're looking at the cities at least, we're looking at residential rates within the capital cities of each of those provinces, or the largest cities, I should say. Ontario's electricity rates are about double that of Quebec, or Toronto versus Montreal. And, oops. And substantially more than like 64% more than electricity rates in Winnipeg. So, and that's essentially because we generate most of our electricity from nuclear power, and they generate most of their electricity from water power. And interestingly, they both have lots of excess water power that they're selling to the United States. So Ontario is at a crossroads. We have, like I said, this aging nuclear fleet, 18 working reactors, and they're all coming to the end of their lives within the next decade. And the province is moving forward with rebuilding 10 nuclear reactors. The public doesn't know it. The activist community doesn't know it. The NGOs are barely talking about it. So these are the two current campaigns that we're running. The one on the left is specifically focused on the 6 reactors that the province is negotiating a long-term contract with privately run Bruce Nuclear Industry, business essentially, consortium. They are the largest nuclear station in the world, 8 reactors. Working reactors. 2 have already been rebuilt at massive overcost and time, and they're now negotiating plans to rebuild the 6 reactors, and they're negotiating with the government of Ontario to make a long-term deal with the government of Ontario to sell electricity to us at very high cost, and we take the risk and they take the profit. The Bruce Nuclear Consortium takes the profit. there's an accident, liability, cost overruns, the Ontario taxpayers take that risk. And the campaign on the right is the provinces moving forward. They've already committed their first $1 billion to rebuilding the Darlington nuclear station, 4 reactors. They had intended to build 2 new reactors as well, and that got canceled due to public advocacy by our organization and others, which asked for transparency on the cost overruns. And when government finally listened to that and called for fixed price bids, meaning they couldn't, so industry up to that point, government, the publicly owned industry essentially, OPG, when they claimed that the 2 new reactors were to cost $6.8 billion, and we advocated, we knew that every nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone on average 2.5 times over budget. So we wanted transparent contract that the taxpayers would not be left with the cost overruns. And the government actually did it for the first time in Canadian history, called for a fixed price bid, after we went door to door in the energy minister's riding with literature. And the contract came back, guess what? It was $26 billion. Even though the industry had been saying 6.8. And the government got sticker shock and canceled the new build project. So that was a big success. But now they're moving forward with the 4 rebuilt reactors at Darlington at very high cost. And it's on Lake Ontario. So those are our 2 campaigns. The Darlington one, we're campaigning very hard to replace that Darlington rebuild with water power imports from Quebec. We've got the grid between the 2 provinces already there, and Quebec has enough excess electricity to supply us with enough electricity to replace Darlington. Thank you. Okay, so looking at the costs of all these different energy options. So on the far left, we have 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So this is the bulk of the electricity exports out of Quebec to other jurisdictions, primarily, well, some to Ontario, Cornwall, Ontario, and south to Vermont. And I think even New York they sell some. But on the spot market, so the bulk, I think it's, and Rael is the expert on this, but 88% of our of Quebec's exports are sold at 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, so the bulk of them. And we're offering them, we're suggesting a better price. But next to that would be energy efficiency at 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's always cheaper to reduce demand, to put money into reducing demand rather than producing new supply. These are government figures. That's what government says it costs them to reduce demand, 3.5 cents. We're suggesting giving Quebec 6 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity. So they're selling the bulk of them at 3 cents. We're suggesting let's give them 6 cents. They gain, we gain by not having to rebuild our nuclear reactors. The next one is Quebec wind power. Last year they made a 500 kilowatt agreement to purchase wind power at 7.6 cents a kilowatt hour. Rael is saying they've more recently than that, purchased a wind electricity at 6.5 cents, and compared to Texas, which recently is paying 3 cents. So as people have said in this conference already, the price of wind electricity is coming down so rapidly. Meanwhile, the price of nuclear generation keeps going up and up and up. So the next one is the Darlington Rebuild Project, OPG. The government institution claims that the government Crown Corporation, which wants to rebuild Darlington, claims that it will cost 8.9 cents a kilowatt hour. That's their estimate. Now, we know that we'll be stuck with the cost overruns. Let's say if it was times 2.5, which every other reactor project has been, it'll be closer to 16.6 cents. It'll cost us, whoops. Sorry. The Bruce Nuclear Generating Facility, which is a private consortium, again, as Arnie so eloquently puts it, we pay them a private consortium, they get the profits, we get the risks. We're paying them for we just recently went through a rebuild of the first 2 reactors at Bruce A units 1 and 2. We're paying them 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour. So that gives some perspective to us giving, let's say, buying hydroelectricity from Quebec at 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is, and where we came up with that is halfway between what the bulk of your exports are, which is 3 cents, and what OPG claims will cost. So their sort of high cost estimate at 9 cents. So halfway between that would be 6 cents. And a few years ago, Quebec did make a long-term contract for electricity sales to Vermont at 5.8 cents. So 6 cents is kind of reasonable, but we don't have to quibble, we can negotiate. We're calling on Couillard, the Premier of Quebec, to negotiate a deal with Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, to make a good deal. Either way, you know, whether it's 6 or 7 or 8 cents, it's still much cheaper than rebuilding our nuclear stations and much lower risk because we don't have to deal with the waste and the risk, the liability, etc. So I think other speakers have really dealt with all these issues very clearly. I'm not going to get into them today, but there's so many more problems than just cost. But we choose to focus on the cost because all the political spectrum, left to right, gets that. You know, there's some debate or controversy maybe around the waste or the danger liabilities, but there is no controversy. The people who support nuclear cannot challenge our costs. And, you know, why should taxpayers have to pay? Why wouldn't the Taxpayers Association support our campaign? We're lobbying them and the right wing as much as we are trying to get the Green Party and the NDP on side. So it's just a strategy for us to focus on cost. Quebec, as many of you will know, shut down Gentilly. You had already spent, and correct me if I'm wrong, $1 billion rebuilding. So it was already in the process of rebuilding it. Was it $1 billion? Yeah, and when the Bloc Québécois got elected? Or is it the PQ? Yep, thank you. I always get those mixed up. When the PQ got elected, one of the things they did right off the bat is shut down the Gentilly nuclear rebuild project. Partly because you had lots of renewable hydroelectricity and you didn't need the electricity. But it's, you know, it was a great success. It's the only nuclear station in North America that's been shut down. Even though it had already spent $1 billion, I like to use it as an example because we've now spent $1 billion rebuilding Darlington. There's nothing to say that we can't cancel that midstream. Yep. When I say that the bulk of Quebec's exports are at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, that comes from the Quebec Energy Commission. That's a provincial government body. And they're saying right now they're selling, so 2014 they're selling about, that's 20 terawatt hours, or 2,000 megawatts, more or less, right now at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And they predict that that will grow to 2020 when they'll have 3,000 kilowatt hours. And that's, interestingly, about what we need to replace Darlington. So we're offering you an opportunity to make a lot of money on a good long-term sale with your next-door neighbor, who you already have the grid. You'll have very little opposition to selling it. We'll have no opposition to purchasing it from the public. Polling suggests that the most popular electricity option is hydroelectricity, much more popular than nuclear power. Solar is also very popular with the public. Okay. So, and interestingly, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a report released. 60 Canadian scholars across the country put together a climate plan for the country of Canada. And in their electricity section, they talked about east-west grid exchange rather than north-south. That is, sharing Canada's massive hydroelectricity opportunities was part of the way to move Canada to a renewable future. So to conclude, it would be very much a win-win prospect for both Ontario and Quebec. So Quebec could earn 14, and the chair of the Clean Air Alliance is an economist, and so he puts everything into dollar figures, and it makes it just much more real for people to understand. If we were to purchase that electricity from you at 6 cents a kilowatt hour, let's say, Quebec would earn $14 billion over the 20-year contract, and we would save $20 billion over the 20-year contract. Quebec has the excess capacity, needs the market, and incidentally, I would like to add that Quebec is the largest electricity user per capita in the world because you have so much excess, low-cost power here. So the opportunity really is for you to invest in conservation. I said it's around 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. If you were to invest more in conservation, you would have more hydro to sell across border south or west. Ontario could forgo the Darlington Rebuild project. And there's some debate within Ontario. So as we started building support for this campaign, the provincial government did their own study to say, oh, it would cost a lot of money for us to upgrade the transmission lines to be able to import that much hydroelectricity. Excellent. And they said it would cost $2 billion. Now, interestingly, $2 billion out of that $14 billion, that's a good payback still. We're going to earn 14, it's going to cost us 2. Well, okay, so we're only going to earn 12. But we challenged that report and analyzed it, and our analysis was that it would only cost $500 million to upgrade the grid. It was just one section of the grid that would need upgrading, which would have a payback in less than a year. And we presented that to the government commission that came up with that study, and they couldn't disregard our analysis. So they're fudging it themselves. Just by way of an example, the big issue, as we always know, is jobs. So that's, maybe that's what most people in Ontario think. Well, we could do without the nuclear power, but we have those 2,000 jobs at Darlington and another 2,500 jobs or something at the Bruce station. Those communities are dependent on those jobs. Well, Ontario phased out coal over a 17-year period. That was also the #1 resistance. All those jobs, there was 2,200 jobs at the 5 coal plants. But over those 17 years, they were shut down one at a time, phased out. Workers moved to different parts of the corporation. It took, we lost jobs to attrition, people retired, people took generous packages, and there was 0 job dislocation. So the #1 resistance never came to be. So it's kind of a false argument. So relative to the nuclear phase out in Ontario, that would happen over time too. We're not saying do it today. Darlington is scheduled to shut down in 2020. That's when you have more access. That would happen over time. Plus, we're going to need jobs for waste, decommissioning. And I think the decommissioning issue is a really big issue we should be talking about today. That's where the jobs are. Let's not wait for 40 years to decommission them. Let's start now. In terms of jobs, how much they cost? The Darlington rebuild jobs cost Ontario taxpayers $6 million per job. Next. Yep. Okay, that's my conclusion. And I'd just like to say, if you're interested in this campaign, we have a Quebec email list and then a global email list. And we're very political. Every 2 weeks we're saying, click here to send a letter to the Premier. We do lots of outreach. I'm happy to add, there's an email list here. Please just leave me your email. You can unsubscribe anytime. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you.
And I will introduce you. Je vais vous présenter quelqu'un que je connais quand même depuis quelques années. Je l'ai connu plus du temps qu'il était au conseil d'administration de la Fondation Rivière. Réal Reid. Réal Reid is a friend of mine, a colleague, a volunteer colleague on many issues, particularly when he works for the Fondation Rivière. Réal Reid is graduated from Polytechnique, École Polytechnique in Montreal. He do a master in aeronautic propulsion in Cranefield, UK. And he has also a diploma in administration. He works a few years in Pratt & Whitney, aeronautical constructor on the south shore of Montreal, in Longueuil. And he works for the CRIC. Le CRIC, it's Centre de Recherche Industrielle du Québec. After he was in Environment Canada department, on question of automobile pollution, and he works for IREC. It's the Research Institute of Hydro-Quebec. It's called IREC, on the question of windmill issue and wind energy. And he's the author of a very interesting reference book on wind energy. It's called, this book is L'éolien au cœur de l'incontournable révolution énergétique, or the wind energy and in the heart of revolution, energetic revolution. He was also a member, administrator of the Canadian, l'Association canadienne de l'énergie éolienne. En anglais, c'est le?
Canadian Wind Energy Association.
Thank you, Rial. Rial Reid, 15 minutes, please. Go.
Just a little correction. I'm the co-author of the book. We wrote it at 2. Good fights.
Who was the other author?
Bernard Saunier, an ex-colleague from IREC on wind energy as well. Okay. I'm going to repeat lots of the things that Angela showed you, so be patient. So, okay. So, shall we? Okay. We're talking basically a comparison between nuclear or renewable energy. A nuclear power plant can supply constant power, cannot really follow the load easily. Last one that tried was Chernobyl. So you don't play with the throttle on a nuclear power plant. Wind, solar, and water power on their own, they're renewable energy, they're variable, they have limited load following capacity. But with storage, wind is reliable, can follow the load, solar is as well, and wind energy as well. Next. You have the general picture of the total electricity production of Canada. It's around 600 terawatt hours. Next. Quebec produced 200, a third of that. Installed capacity by province, that's total electricity production. Bottom we could say gigawatt, or anyway. British Columbia, Manitoba, and Quebec are hydro province. Around 95, 96, 93% hydro. Ontario 25, 59, so Angela showed better numbers than that. British Columbia, Manitoba, and hydro are ideally located within Canada to facilitate storage regulation. I'll show you a graph on that later. Not only for themselves, but the whole of Canada. So Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba can supply the regulation for variable energy because of the large storage capacity. And not only for hydroelectric, could also work for wind and solar. Next. You can see the picture. For instance, if Ontario wants regulation, they can get it from their neighbor on the west or their neighbor on the east. And Quebec can do the regulation for Ontario or the Maritimes, and British Columbia and Manitoba could share regulation for renewable energy for Alberta, Saskatchewan. Next. It's not my idea. It was presented in 2000 Canada in Vancouver by Gaëtan Lafrance. Quebec's annual electricity production is around 200 terawatt hours, mostly hydro. Our total consumption of everything, gas, petroleum, and biomass is around 500 terawatt hours. We had a nuclear program. Gentilly 1 was experimental, then Gentilly 2. Gentilly 1 last 7 years has been dismantled. Start of operation, Quebec 1983, Gentilly last year produced 3.9 terawatt hours. Cost of refurbishing had been approved in 2008 at $1.9 billion. And when they finally closed it, the cost had risen to 4.3 billion. And dismantling is supposed to take 50 years. Next. A twin example of it is Pointe-le-Pro, New Brunswick. Refurbishing started in 2008, was supposed to cost 1.4 million in the last 18 months. It took 3 times as long and 2.5 times more expensive. Next. So to operate with entirely renewable energy from water, you need a large storage capacity. You cannot do it without storage. Storage was done with hydraulic reservoirs. We have almost 30,000 square kilometers of artificial reservoirs in Quebec. That's 6 times the area of Montreal Island. Covered for 2 consecutive years of low water input, Quebec had to maintain a minimum storage of 70 terawatt hours. You cannot empty your reservoirs because the year after you may be in trouble. Next. So you see here why we need storage. The blue line is the demand, is monthly demand. Red is the water input. So we get most of our energy in May, June with the snow melt. But our big demand is in winter, December, January, February, March. But if you can figure out a network with 100% wind, you will overproduce slightly in winter and underproduce slightly in summer, which means that you don't need as much storage for wind than you do for hydro. And with the actual reservoir capacity in Quebec, you can store about 5 times more energy. You can accommodate 5 times more wind energy than you can accommodate water energy. And you don't even lose your capacity to produce water energy. Next. And so, already said that. Next one. Oops. Okay, exportation in 2012, Quebec exported 30 terawatt hours, mostly to New England. And we have large surplus. Ontario has to refurbish their nuclear power plant. So, asking the question, could it work? Next. A good picture of surpluses was painted by the Commission César Énergétique du Québec, which was held in 2013. And to figure out the amount of surplus, they took the current surplus, they added the project under construction, project under contract with private producers. Next. You see the picture here. The last one is a demand, is not necessarily. But you end up with surplus around from 2018 on of over 40 terawatt hours. Next. Of that, Hydro-Quebec can export during periods of peak price. I don't think they will want to lose that. So they're left with about 30 terawatt hours, which they get something like 3-4 cents at export. One of the problem is that hydro being a renewable energy, the amount of energy, the amount of water they receive in snow or rain is variable. So we have a standard deviation over mean, a variation of 10%. And for a normal distribution that contains about 6-7% or 2/3 of the data, or 2/3 of the years, which means that a year in over 3 would be over 10%. Or a year over 6 would be above normal, which is no problem to guarantee a contract, and a year over 6 would be below normal, which means that you have to do something, because you will lose 20 terawatt hours, and then you're left with only 10 terawatt hours of surplus that you can guarantee. Next. And to overcome this problem, in order to supply 200 terawatt hours to the Quebec network, they have to maintain 70 terawatt hours of minimum supply. If we were signing a contract of 20 terawatt hours guaranteed power, for instance, we might have to increase the minimum to 80 terawatt hours. Or The other one is the Quebec demand period is winter with space heating, because we are using just about every new house built in Quebec is run with electric heating, whereas Ontario's peak demand is in summer for air conditioning, so that should alleviate the problem. Next. Another one will be that you might have to increase your production. But if you look at hydro, the last project, La Romaine, will be, which is under construction, will cost over 9 cents a kilowatt hours. Hydro will say 6.4 or 6.3 or even said 5.9, but that is without accounting a reasonable yield on their own investment. And the other projects will be further out, will be more costly. And wind energy project, if we were doing them properly, like they do in some regions of the United States, could be done at a very cost-effective way. But main one is before you sign a contract, you will have to analyze everything very carefully. Next. So Quebec energy source, will show you the next graph. You can go to the next one, yeah, okay. We did some, I was representative of, comment on dit, développement durable, sustainable development on the Plan Nord and on the energy side, and we look at all the different ones. The main source of energy that Quebec has is wind energy at 14,000 terawatt hours. Remember that our total consumption is 500, and solar will be about 3,000. So the two of them constitute 98% of Quebec's available sources. Hydro, there's 50 terawatt hours left, but it's not necessarily, 50 terawatt hours is a lot, but 14 is a bit more. Anyway, so the amount of wind will be sufficient, will be sufficient to supply Canada, United States, and Mexico twice over current electricity consumption. Next. Oh, so do we have enough resource? The answer is yes. And we could supply seawater power, and wind could help supply, help if there was a dwindling surplus, or if Hydro-Quebec find very interesting long-term project, or it could be new industry or something, so they'd be able to meet it at cost-effective. Next. Okay, winds in Canada are very, very, very good. They operate wind turbines in Spain at around 6 meters per second, and you remember that energy in wind is proportional to the cube speed of wind. Next. And in the state, with winds which are not quite as good as Quebec's wind, they're selling electricity at the cost. They're signing projects for 20-year power purchase agreement, they call them, for 3.3 cents kilowatt hour. Next. This is an annual report that's produced by the peoples in the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory for the Department of Energy in the United States, and it shows the cost of energy. So the blue one would be in the central, and that's mostly from Texas to Dakotas, I think, basically heading towards Manitoba. They get wind project that they sign contracts at $20, which is 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And this is done by private producers. To that, you have to add the power, the production tax credit, which is at 2.3 cents, but for 10 years. If you spread it over 20 years, it's worth about 1.3 cents. So they're basically making profit, private producers, at 3.3 cents. In Quebec, we have a great project, which is a project to create employment in remote areas using wind, and that's very expensive. So it's not the way to go to get cheap energy. Next. Okay, and we compare that for future cooperation, if, we talk about surplus, getting hydropower from Quebec, and then Ontario needs more power, we could supply it with wind energy from Quebec because of our better winds, it will be about 2 cents a kilowatt hour cheaper than producing it in Ontario. Next. You see the map here, the winds around the James Bay area in Ontario are around 7 something meters per second, whereas in Quebec we get 9 to 10. So joint Ontario, so we have enough energy. Next. Quebec has plenty of energy, that could supply energy to Ontario at very low risk of cost overrun, being cut, not being able to supply. And so we have there could be future projects that could be very interesting. But if Ontario decides to develop their own energy, Quebec could at least supply the regulation from its reservoirs, storage. So project seems it seems technically feasible with very low risk, economically interesting with very low risk again. So it's a win-win or a win-QR program.
A win-win.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes to the discussion. Je vais me permettre, I will just say certain, I was a former politician. Yes, there is. And I was MP for the Bloc Québécois in the federal parliament in another life. And I analyze, first of all, Nature Québec co-signed with Angela and Real Reid. I'm not an independent facilitator. We co-signed a letter, a public letter. Angela noticed that to you a few minutes ago, to sell the idea, to push the idea, not only on the classical sale of electricity, but sale with eco-conditionality. And the main eco-conditionality in English too, and is to phase out the nuclear. But it is an eco-conditionality with win-win also, because the danger of nuclear with dominant winds and with problems of water, we protect ourselves in Quebec by this type of phasing out. But it is new. There is not a lot of style of contract, and there is a lot of challenge. Hydro-Quebec tried to buy energy New Brunswick Energy. And there is a strong reaction because there is no marketing on this, there is no preparation of population, and people of New Brunswick, by a certain proudness, refuse to pay less for their own electricity because they don't want to depend of the electricity of Quebec. We think it's a good thing they canceled because there was a buy of Pointe-le-Pro, a second nuclear plant by Hydro, and for us it is absolutely unacceptable. But some things are logical, but there is sensitivity in the population, and even great ideas can die because there is a sensitivity. There was in the past a deal between Newfoundland and Labrador to buy electricity at a very low cost. And in Canada, in Newfoundland, it creates a type of a psychological shock. And it is still back in this negotiation. And we in Nature Québec criticize a lot the contract with Vermont because we say we pay 10 cents for La Romaine. We pay a lot for new energy that we produce, for the wind energy, because it is more than a regional development program. And we will send all our surpluses and maybe more to phase out nuclear. We have to be very, very strategic, very step by step. We have a discussion. Yesterday, the 5 organizations from Quebec emit a press release to support the sale, but saying we will begin by the surplus and not by efficient energy that we still not made, but step by step. It's good, it's interesting because on the spot market it's only 3 cents 8% of time. It's good in waiting, and we have to, but we don't have a real energy policy in Quebec. We don't have the integrated resource planning. We have a lot of things to do, but we want to sell that and not to kill the good idea, not to kill the electric car, not to kill the electric sale. That's a challenge. It's you.